Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to our today's episode of the STP training webinar series. The title for our talk today is Reading Between the Lines, Correcting ATDD Myths and Traps. Our guest speaker joining us on the webinar today is Jason Edstrom. I'm Smita Mishra. I'm a tester myself and a sustainability enthusiast too. And I'm excited today to host you all and Jason on our STP webinars. Before we get started with the webinar, let me quickly take you through some upcoming events and important updates that may interest you. Firstly, we have the Mile High Software Testing Conference coming up on July 28th and July 29th at Denver, Colorado. Please look at milehighTesting.com to review the entire program. It may please you to actually see some world-class leaders speaking there. For any queries with respect to sponsoring, attending, or team registrations, feel free to send an email at info@softwaretestpro.com. So we are inviting proposals for webinars from all of you, and this shall be open all year round, so you can submit anytime you're ready. If you have an idea and wish to be considered for the webinars, do send in your proposals. All the details along with the submission form are at the link given on the screen. Please go through them. There is an upcoming webinar, The Secret Sauce to Continuous Deployment Testing, on the 15th of April. The speaker is Heath Hove, who is the QA Automation Lead, Center Edge Software. In this webinar, Heath is going to talk about secret sauce of automated tests that allows Center Edge Software to continuously deploy most of its web software, both microservices and monoliths. The link is up for you to register. Please do go for it. And if you are on Twitter, please share the conference and call for papers information, and also about this webinar with your followers and connections. You can add STP's Twitter handle to your tweets, which is @SoftwareTestPro. Please do add the hashtag STP webinar to your tweets. You can also note down the Twitter handle for our speaker today, which is @Jason Edstrom. All right, so let's get started with the webinar today. Welcome, Jason. We are very excited to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. So Jason Edstrom is an automation architect at Magenic Technologies who aids organizations in their digital transformation by focusing on automation strategies and implementations. He has a passion for new technology and exploring unconventional methods to solve problems. Now let's get started learning. Let's start learning and reading between the lines, correcting ATDD myths and traps. Jason, the floor is all yours now. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate it. Like it was stated and introduced, this presentation is about reading between the lines and correcting a lot of the myths that come with ATDD and some of the traps that come with it, and incorporating automation into those into the practice, and allowing for us to collaborate and get those conversations flowing that shorten up quality conversation cycles. So first thing, we'll go through the basic introduction, and then we're going to talk about ATDD. I want to make sure that the process is understood, some of the toolings are understood. We're going to talk quickly about the Gartner hype curve and kind of how it impacts technology as a whole, kind of the ebb and flow. You'll see correlations in your everyday life that kind of go with this. And then we're going to talk about some of the myths that come with it and that kind of enamor us and want us to take on this practice. And then some of the traps that kind of come along with it as well. So first off, Jason Edstrom. I'm an automation architect at Magenic Technologies. I've been with Magenic for over 5 years now. I am a big technology enthusiast. Love smart home technology, love mobile technology, and computer hardware and stuff like that. And by nature of being a technology enthusiast, I'm also a habitual edge case. There's typically a joke amongst computer technicians where the technician's computer is always the computer out of service or broken, And that's usually true. We usually stretch our bounds and break our own systems, and then they end up being broken for months. And then below that, I have all of my social contact stuff. I'm working on getting my blog up and running. The domain is there. I just need to start getting content there. So also Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm also on GitHub, and I also participate to a few open source repositories as well. So let's get into kind of the meat that is ATDD. So the typical and traditional development process is we have a BA. BA writes up the requirements, talks with the business, like gets those all collected into a central location and starts producing actionable stories and breaking down the points and going through the ceremony of creating those opportunities for features. And whether it's a waterfall scenario or an agile scenario, you still have to do that requirement collection. So once you get that story process taken care of, the next step is that it is handed over to the developer. Developer then goes through all the code writing and the production of the features, and they do their job, hopefully. Then they package up a code and ship it off and deploy it to an environment, so that way the tester can then start testing that code and making sure it's up to the standards of quality and that it meets the definition of done. So in that process of the code moving from developer to tester, we get bugs and that feedback loop that we strive so consistently for. How do we quicken that feedback loop? How do we make sure that we find bugs quicker and are more thorough in our approaches? So that part naturally happens. So that collaboration process, due to the fact of that exchange, is kind of a wasteful process. We're relying on people coding, doing their job, shipping it to the tester. The tester goes through the deployments, the quality checks, bugs are found, it is then pushed back to the developer, and that's a wasteful process. And then if there is a requirement issue, there's that next step where then all of a sudden we have to go back to the BA and get refinement, which is also a wasteful process because it is once again the scenario of collaboration that is happening injected into the process or part of the chain of events rather than trying to figure out like fully defined and non-ambiguous user stories along the way. So with an ATDD process, the way that it strives to change that is that business owner and BA discuss the business needs. That's pretty typical of the original process. But then you have the three very essential components to ATDD, and that is we call them the three amigos, not like the movie, a little bit different, not as fun, but it consists of the BA, the developer, and the QA involved. This can be like paired up teams for feature sets and stuff like that. But when it comes down to it, the three amigos always consist of those three roles. They elaborate on the requirements, they figure them out together, they work on removing ambiguity and creating a consensus through that collaboration. The next step is a BA. It doesn't necessarily need a BA, but in this example it is. Create structured scenarios using a shared language that they all agree on. And I'm not referring to global languages like Spanish or English or stuff like that. It is talking about in a syntactic language that is like a fundamental core about talking about requirements. So in this scenario, a lot of times Gherkin is used by BAs, and there's a lot of tool that supports it, but we'll continue on that road a little bit later. After that, developers create acceptance tests and then write the application code. And the point of that is to have a plan or like an idea of kind of how this is all going to come together to create that acceptance criteria and the fulfillment of it. The test will fail when they are done writing them. And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that, specifically like early on, because we don't have code and implementation in place yet, so therefore it's going to fail. But as tests are created and the feature is developed, then we start seeing that progress of development, which kind of gives you an interesting benchmark of where a feature is currently sitting. And then after that, any acceptance criteria that cannot be automated should be manually tested. Stuff that is not highly reusable are situations where they should be scrutinized, whether or not it's a manual test or not. And then exploratory testing, figuring out a charter, searching a specific area, creating a recorded chain of events to help reproduce complex bugs with multiple steps involved. And then tests provide the feedback and progress of the documentation, like I was saying before. Because of that, because you'll slowly start seeing the failure rate decrease as the feature moves closer and closer to acceptance. We also use our automation metrics to kind of handle some of that part as well. Some minor modifications that we have seen at Magenic in terms of the ATDD process is the product owner discussion with the BA is normal. The BA, QE, and developer part, that is once again standard to what we've seen in the past. But with the QE creates test scenarios and acceptance criteria, that can be interchanged with the BA or with the developer in that situation, because we as testers, I feel, have the ability to kind of picture something a little bit differently, and that's what makes us good at our jobs. So by allowing a collaborative effort on creating the testable scenarios and that collaboration there, we can use someone with that specified skill set in place. Step 4, QE writes the automated acceptance test rather than the developer in the previous slide. Developer writes the application code, and then together we have an injected quality stance inside of our development process, which is kind of an essential part. It reinforces that feedback loop and shortens the collaboration gaps along the way. This is a scenario where QE and the developers, they break down that adversarial stance that we're kind of used to in our industry, where QA is always in the way and developers are just trying to get code out, like that type of concept. And we kind of break it down because step 4 can work really well in a paired programming scenario where QE is helping define the acceptance criteria and starts asking those deeper detailed questions, and the developer can have input on if that is an acceptable approach to the story with that shared language, and then they can move on to making sure that the rest of the stuff of the test and the feature fits that criteria that we are shooting for. So it creates the opportunity for a highly collaborative development cycle. We have the business and the BA really tightly knit, making sure that the business needs are well heard and well documented, but it is also well communicated to the executors of the vision. And that's where the dev and the QA participant comes in place. And by creating that shared understanding of high collaboration and using a well-developed language pattern between them, it allows for a mutual understanding once it gets down to our acceptance tests and our application code. And then hopefully the things that are found at the end are more so exploratory, like random bugs of technology, usability, like errors that need to kind of be cleaned up before release, or situations like poor requirement definition. It eventually gets to the point where the bugs that show up in the process are more so because of the fact that the requirements and the acceptance criteria are not well defined, rather than it being an outright bug and kind of an escape of poor functionality. You can there's kind of a gray area there, but sometimes you can make that argument. So with this entire process, we're pushing for high collaboration, doing acceptance tests first, making sure that the testing is ready to go from the very beginning before development even starts on the feature. And we're coding and refactoring until the test pass, making sure that we are fulfilling that execution. And by having that shared language and that all those collaboration sessions, we're allowing that to happen. Automating the acceptance test is also a big piece because of the fact that we want those tests to consistently run over and over in the environment to handle the regression. And that also helps with the CI/CD pattern, creating the reports, having that quick feedback loop and progress loop. So we've been talking with a lot of letters, case in point, acceptance test driven development. So we've had 3 different variations of acronyms in the recent history. We have had TDD, which is the unit tests first get developed before the application does. BDD is talking about the behavior of the application and testing that before the code of the application has been written. And then ATDD is coding the acceptance tests before the coding of the application. So that's kind of the 3 layers. A lot of times it feels like TDD and BDD kind of got together, figured out the parts of like their methodologies that worked, and came up with ATDD. There's a lot of commonalities between the 3 areas because they kind of built off of each other. Gherkin is typically that shared language that is used. I've seen BAs use it, development unit tests have used it, we've used it in toolings for automation. So that is typically the shared language that we see being used across the 3 amigo ATDD party elements. So the basis for Gherkin is that we are talking about behavior. Gherkin is from the BDD tooling, but it can be used in an ATDD scenario. It's not required. Sometimes it is just an increase in workload. It is a difficult workload to all of a sudden adopt and take in, and you have to kind of commit to it. But this is what is being used as the 3 amigos shared language. The main keywords are feature, that is talking about the overall file. It is kind of like your test class. A feature file is a user login or login authentication or something to that effect. The scenario level is a particular behavior. When a user logs in, they should see an invalid authentication message if it's an incorrect login. So that kind of just defines what we are testing for the scenario. It's pretty much a test description. It's like a method name or a method signature name, but just in like plain English. Steps are typically given, when, then, and then there's usually ands. I haven't seen too many people use but in there, but that is how the steps are defined, is this stepping through process about talking about the overall behavior patterns. So, given that I am a user, when I log in, I should see a marketplace portal or something like that. So that is how we can kind of define some of that. Pre-test steps you can kind of define as a setup for it. If your given is really massive, it gets to a point where it kind of is like an Uber test, and it just makes it very unreadable and very unkempt. But you can abstract some of that and pull that into pre-test steps called the background. You can also data drive this stuff by using data tables or examples or stuff like that. Those are other metrics that are, or elements that are part of an ATDD tooling. And there is a decent amount of tooling out there. Cucumber has a wide range of support, Ruby, Python, JavaScript, Java. It works very well for what it is doing. When it comes down to it, taking real text and applying it to a method and executing a method is a pretty impressive feat. And then SpecFlow has the corner on the market for C#. There's not a lot of difference between how those tools function. They're pretty much the same, even though some of the syntax changes, and there are some components of each tool that doesn't exist in the other, but overall, they work pretty consistently across the board. So just to give a decent Gherkin example, like this is a airline status dealing with frequent flyer miles. So you can see that we're defining our scenario with an overall expectation of what we're trying to accomplish. The given sets up the precondition, and we use an and to add an extra conditional to it. And then the when sets up kind of the cause of it, and the then is usually the verification of the effect. And then in BDD tooling, typically and is treated like the previous statement. So if an and follows a given, it's technically being treated as a given. Same thing in this example, when there's a then, ands that precede or that come after it are treated like thens. So thens are usually assertions or verification points, and some tools maintain that and enforce that expectation. And here's kind of like an example moved over into a like actual BDD syntax. We can see that it has two different scenarios. The scenario outline below is giving an example of how you use data driving, how you insert data into the scenario and produce multiple tests with common statements. There's one extra tag up on top called narrative, and that's kind of giving us an opportunity to comment and give extra context to the test file as it is. So that is Gherkin and kind of how that sets up the tooling overall. This is called the hype curve. Some of you may have seen it, but usually the flow of a hype curve is you start out with an introduction, like a technology triggers this forward movement in practice. And that's kind of where we get the initial start. And then this upward action as time and visibility increases is positive hype. So we start getting enamored and enthusiastic about this tool and understanding what it can provide us in terms of value. So we get a lot of these awesome stories of productivity, and that's all we hear. We don't hear any of the negatives. We don't hear anything that leads us to believe that this is not the way to go. And then we hit like absolute peak of inflated expectations. Like, we've heard only good things. We love this. We want to bring this internally. There's no way that this can fail, because look at all of these success stories. Like, this has to be the silver bullet, the perfect essence of software development. And then reality sets in. We implement it into our project. We start trying to execute based off of the guidelines that ATDD sets forth. And we're starting to see pitfalls. We're starting to stumble a little bit. And then we hit the trough of disillusionment. We've kind of hit that emotional rock bottom of the scenario where we start seeing all the problems that it's causing and the added work, and how it could technically be geared as or construed as a failure, just because of the fact that we're just seeing so many caveats to the expectations that we didn't initially expect. But as we start learning and growing and understanding where the process fits, where the tool provides value, and where the process provides value, we start getting enlightened. We start understanding what we're accomplishing. And then we hit this plateau of productivity where everything, like we've hit that homeostasis where we are understanding what is going on, and we understand the warning signs, we can mitigate them, we can start moving our project forward, and we maintain velocity consistently sprint after sprint. So let's get into our myths. So one of the first big myths is that ATDD is a tool. And this is a kind of a big myth that it consistently kind of needs to be debunked. When someone sees Gherkin tooling, they're like, oh, that is ATDD. And it's not, it's a process. And it's also a culture shift. Like, just like how Agile is a culture shift, it is something that needs to be embodied by the team and needs to be respected and taken appropriately and worked to understand how that process lives and strives inside of your organization. And it's entirely reasonable to say that we're not ready for it right now. But there are other scenarios where you are ready, you need to like break down some of these understandings about what ATDD is. And the biggest one is a process. I would also say that if with this process, you need to be all in. You need to understand that by embodying this, which is the culture shift, that is how you move yourself forward in terms of executing. And the creator of Cucumber, I would put the quote down below. If you think Cucumber is a testing tool, continue reading because you are wrong. And that's very real. People take Cucumber to be this like holy grail testing tool, and it's not a testing tool. Like BDD wasn't a testing tool either. It was a full-blown process. It was just whether or not you executed it appropriately to get the value out of it. The next myth is that the BEAs are writing the automation tests, which kind of, sort of, not really. They are writing the Gherkin, but what is actually writing those automation tests, like the Gherkin itself, is more so the collaboration effort. That collaboration process is what allows for the Gherkin to be written. It allows for so everyone to have this common understanding and common approach to how they are viewing the story, the feature, the execution, what the quality of that feature is. That is ultimately where the value comes from, is the collaboration rather than the in-transit time of taking it from BA to developer to QA and back up the chain again, and all these side meetings. So that's where we're getting the value. This is kind of a big one. We see this a decent amount throughout a lot of organizations. The approach that they want to take manual testers and get them the right automation. But it's not a situation of investing in the manual testers to teach them how to write code like Java or C# or JavaScript or Python. It's not an effort like that. It is more along the lines of how do we get manual testers to not have to invest in their education, but be able to get them to contribute to the overall work effort. And that's an oversimplification of technically what is happening underneath the tool. If you're mis-executing this, all you're technically doing is adding an extra layer onto your automation, which requires more writing time, more coordination by the automation tester, and creates about like 30% more work, 25 to 33% more work, just because of the fact that not everyone is all in on this process. It's not an effort to all of a sudden increase quality while not increasing investment in your resource. And kind of the gray area is that, yeah, the manual testers can help with the Gherkin, writing the Gherkin code. If there's an extra test or an edge case test that needs to all of a sudden be handled, they can help out with that rather than going to the BAs, or else in a collaborative session, they can be taught how to do that. But a lot of this work does have a high learning curve. It requires decent coding practices and understanding of the tool. So it's not a situation where you'll be able to get rid of 90% of your automation writers, like actual coders, and just stick with your manual testers once the framework is up and rolling. It doesn't work like that. As you can see with the syntax on top of that is on top of what normally automation is just this repetitious use of different statements, which is awesome because of the high reusability, but someone has to code that. This is kind of how the flow ends up happening, is that we get acceptance criteria from BAs, developers, and QE, and working through that acceptance criteria, that turns into a feature file which lives in the solution. But then on the right-hand side, these are all the steps being coded and actually turned into automation code. And the side on the right is done by people. So that's not necessarily a situation where you can just have someone automatically, like a computer automatically generate it. The flexibility starts to go down, the quality of the automation starts to go down, you start seeing failure rates, scenarios like that. So And while having a feature file in plain English is a nice side benefit, when it comes down to it, it is technically extra work if ATDD is not implemented appropriately and the collaboration doesn't happen. I've been on projects where development didn't do the Gherkin, the BAs didn't do the Gherkin, so the Gherkin was actually done by the automation testers. They would take the user story, translate it into Gherkin, and then automate on top of it. And at that point, it was just extra work. It wasn't doing anything. And the thought process was kind of leading up to the next myth. And that is, we can finally read the automation test scripts. You know, it's in plain English. We can understand what is going on. I don't know how to read code, therefore I'm able to now understand what is going on inside of my tester's head, which overall is kind of a nice thought, but really, that wasn't what was stopping you from getting involved and ingraining yourself in the process before. It's more or less an excuse just to try to figure out a way to justify why you are not ingrained that way. A lot of ATDD practices can be implemented without a Gherkin-based tool. I can build a reporter to do the given when then statements based off of a page object model and not ever have to write a lick of Gherkin. If my manager or my stakeholder just wants to see the given when thens, that's easy to get to without producing this extra work. So that's something to kind of take away is, do you actually want ATDD, or do you just want the fancy wording? Do you just want to see what's happening in a more human readable language, which you can get that in so many different ways, whether it be better code commenting, better coding practices in terms of methods and class names and stuff like that. So this should not be the aspiration for ATDD, is that finally you can read the test scripts, because that once again goes back to the fact that Cucumber is not a testing tool, it is a collaboration tool. It is a communication and collaboration tool that is supposed to bridge across multiple sectors of the development cycle. All right, so we're gonna jump into the trap section of kind of the warning signs and the areas that I've seen along the way, some of the war stories that kind of come with this. It's the thought that count, not the words. As you can see in the picture, they're dressed the same, but they're different people. They're like different hair, slightly different hair color, a little bit different hair length, but you know, they're close. So Gherkin-based tools are simplistic in how they turn words into application or automation flow. So consistency is a very big deal. What it prevents is the have to rework stories over and over again in order for the automation to comply. So there's a significant area of avoidance and mitigation here. As a decent example, for say a given statement, given an admin user is logged in, given an admin is logged in, given that I am logged in as an admin, all the same thought, all the same like conceptual behavior, but each would resolve differently technically in a ATDD tool. And that's a kind of a big detail. Being inconsistent in your Gherkin means that you have automation that you have steps that will get recreated. You'll have code duplication in ways that you don't really want it, and creates a maintenance nightmare. But you also have situations where as the framework matures, if you have inconsistent statements, then you're not benefiting from it, and then it's just creation of more work. There are times when it's a later feature story comes along that's in an already developed area of the framework, and the first 6 out of 8 statements are exactly the same steps that have already been executed before. They're just enhancing that feature. So all of a sudden we benefit from the automation standpoint because we already have the Gherkin file collaboratively built by the 3 amigos. And then we can take that a little bit farther. And the QE is only required technically to write those last 2 statements and fulfill those last 2 statements. So via the collaboration effort. That is how you save yourself time, save yourself effort. It reduces the opportunity for that 25 to 30% effort increase in your automation maintenance. So finding a way to enforce consistency for your BAs or your devs or your QA that are writing the Gherkin, enforcing that consistency is very important. A lot of IDEs do autocomplete, and they handle Cucumber autocomplete. There are Gherkin type plugins for Jira, like X-Ray, where they don't have autocomplete. They do the syntactic highlighting. They respect kind of the given when thens and a lot of the syntax for Gherkin, but it doesn't help you to make sure that you are consistently writing the same statement over and over and over again. So that is a big mitigation point, is that if you can find a way to either enforce the consistency or rely on the collaboration sessions to mitigate the consistency problem. Because I've had scenarios where I had two BAs not working in silos. I would get back sets of scenarios that were inconsistently written. And when the project moved farther down the line, full sections of statements would be missing just because eventually they forgot to add that part in, such as like the login part, like I am using this user, that type of thing. This is kind of a big one. Consistency will become a maintenance trap and will easily help you hit that 25% extra effort unless you start mitigating it from the beginning and create a process to solve it. So the next part is ATDD is highly agile. It requires teams to communicate consistently and high involvement of the business owner, like the product owner, the business, the stakeholder. So it requires that heavy integration of the team and everyone being together and working through changes and addressing them quickly. Because a lot of times the automation of the practice, or not a lot of times, all the time, based off of the process diagrams that we were going through before, automation is in sprint. Not necessarily the maintenance of old scripts that change is always in sprint. That is part of the maintenance task, but the automation to this effect is in sprint because of the fact that that is how you get to your definition of done, and that is how you inject quality into your development cycle. And then in terms of implementing ATDD as a whole, it needs to be an organizational culture shift. Doesn't necessarily need to be the entire organization, but like buy-in from the stakeholder all the way down, like from that type of an organizational unit, it can just be limited to. And then also relying on the CI/CD capabilities and stable environments in order to make sure that when tests are checked in, they're failing, and as code is checked in for features and updated, tests will start passing either farther along before they pass completely, or there is a major defect which allows for a conversation to start having collaboratively. Another big trap, and I was kind of hinting at this a little bit earlier, is isolation. If anyone of the three amigos is working in isolation, writing the Gherkin, like the testers are the only ones writing the Gherkin because it's seen as a testing tool, or only the BAs are writing it, so therefore it is a testing tool, or a communication tool, or an edict down to the rest of the team. You need to be all in on this practice, or else it's not ATDD. It's just the tool supports the process. The process doesn't support the tool. That's one of the major takeaway pieces of this practice. And there are some more warning signs that kind of come from it. The three amigos discussions that don't result in scenarios being written and dredged out, whether that is a wasteful time and you're not coming to a common understanding of what a feature is. those meetings should have production of assets and understanding and user stories and tests and stuff like that. So it's very important that those collaboration sessions happen and there's a tangible reward for it. Another big warning sign is if your test results are not being respected or they're just being ignored, not addressing the maintenance scenarios, it just becomes a situation of bad quality and bad agile practices, and it's also indicative of like a failing of the agile process as well as the ATDD process. If you're not adjusting your testing expectations or your testing strategy or watching how your quality is changing, then you're not really responding to that feedback loop. It's kind of like someone yelling in your ears and you plugging them with your fingers. It doesn't really produce the value for you. So one of the other parts is just poor testing, like having good testable scenarios that are being put together by the three amigos. That needs to start happening. The paradox talks about how using pesticides on a crop has the ability to accept the natural predator-prey dynamic in an ecosystem. Therefore, you could produce more pests because of the fact that you are getting rid of the things that would naturally take care of that. So in terms of software, you'll only find bugs that your tests are strong enough to find. That's what it primarily comes down to, is that eventually the types of bugs that you'll find are resistant to your testing methodologies. Another big part is poor coding standards, both on the automation side and the development side, where if code is not effectively unit tested and tested by the automation and conceived and handled well, that kind of becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy of the failure of the project. Another thing that kind of comes into play in kind of the poor coding practice is also poor planning. Just because of the fact that there's this highly collaborative session doesn't mean that you get to move other things. One of the projects I was on that was working on this, for the first 2 months, no wireframes, no prototyping was happening. Amongst some of the other red flags that were happening on the project, what was happening was that all of a sudden it was my job to create this automation test, and the dev was off creating his own concept of what it was, and we were nowhere in sync in that scenario. But another part that was happening was then he would go back to the product owner and demo what he did, and the product owner wasn't happy with the execution of his vision. So other parts of coding, just because we're starting this highly collaborative process does not mean that things that we typically do should fall by the wayside. The prototyping and wireframing is arguably part of development too, because it's planning the execution of the vision. Is taking that theory or that hypothetical idea and putting it on paper for the first time, that type of a piece. So that is also very important, is that UX design and prototyping phase is also part of that collaboration space. So scenarios being UI centric and doesn't focus on business value. That kind of comes from the whole point of like, I'm clicking on this, I'm inputting this. We need the whole point of ATDD is to abstract everything to the point where it's common use and reusable. That is a very important detail because it allows for us to abstract the minutia and make sure that we focus on what the behavior of the test is and what the application is under test. So the next line down, we talk about if your scenario steps are too low level, if you're talking about on this page I am clicking this, on this page I am doing this, that is way too low level, and you need to kind of bring yourself back up. Like user logs in is a perfect behavior thought process versus user gets to login page, enters username, enters password, clicks submit, then is logged in. Like that is too far down into the weeds, and it becomes less reusable over time. ultimately, when everything is said and done, the intention of ATDD is to be, and its success is to be the culture shift. One team, one dream, trying to bring all that development team together and work in harmony and in sync to make sure that they can push through the traps and the productivity loss, some of the productivity challenges and stuff like that, and the learning gaps to push themselves forward, and also get automation to be sustainable and an essential part of your process. And by doing all of this, it means that you can get more high quality deliverables released in an effective amount of time. Once again, the value of the process is not, the value of ATDD is not the tool, it's the process and the collaboration that happens in the process. Everything else can fall away, but the core purpose of ATDD is to create a highly collaborative and quick moving process. And that is all I have. Any questions?
Hey, thank you so much, Jason. It was a very insightful session, and I'm sure our attendees learned a lot. There are some questions. So our first question is, at what point are you introducing the negative tests and performance tests?
So in terms of negative tests, so situations of like invalid login, a lot of those negative scenarios should be also part of the acceptance criteria because of the fact that not everything can be happy path, right? There always has to be a counteraction to your action. And if you log in inappropriately, that should happen there. Performance tests in that scenario, that is something where you can have, whether it be a performance automation engineer in play along with them to help pull that along. It's even a situation where they don't need to necessarily be ingrained in the initial like ATDD workflow. That could be a situation where performance testing could even be lagging a sprint to protect the three amigos and their velocity and maintenance of the main automation. And then performance can wait while deliverables are still being pushed out or even delayed once the framework is more mature and the overall workload decreases, then you can rely on it then. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Our next question is, what is the best approach to defining the BDD plan and tests? Can you elaborate on when it's best to use TDD, that is test-driven development, behavior-driven development, or acceptance test-driven development, or are they mutually exclusive?
I think it's a different, like it's an evolution process. So like TDD came along when we started writing our unit tests before we even wrote any of our any of our feature code. And then we took it a little bit farther and used BDD tooling to talk about the behavior, rather than talking about the units, the individual units of process, we're talking about the behavior and reflecting the behavior of the application. So ATDD is kind of like the next step of the evolution process, where we're now taking our acceptance criteria and coding our acceptance criteria tests beforehand. So it's not necessarily a situation where you use TDD in the scenario and BDD in this scenario. It's kind of by the fact of using ATDD, you're kind of using those other methodologies because they all kind of reinforce each other. Even doing the unit tests, like if developers still do their unit tests, they can still employ a TDD practice or a BDD practice on their level, and then on the automation level, that is an ATDD practice. Therefore, you're getting multiple levels of testing happening by multiple elements of this collaboration party.
Our next question here, Jason, is how do you use ATDD in an agile environment wherein a 2-week sprint, the feature specifications are defined on the go by the whole team? Is that clear to you, the question?
2-week sprint, and the specs are already defined by the entire team?
Yes. Are
Okay.
defined on the go
So,
by the whole team.
oh, okay. So that kind of breaks down what the whole point of the collaboration process is. You can have those planning meetings along the way, but you should usually be entering into a sprint with some of this planning already happening ahead of time, not necessarily like on a micro level, but more along the lines of you want to have some idea or direction along the way versus like, oh, we need a story for this. Let's get it built up. So having a vision and a kind of a direction to go is kind of one of the parts of this collaboration process. But if everything is happening, if user stories are happening on the fly, remember the main goal of ATDD is the collaboration, getting dev, QE, and the BA all in the same room and coming to a common understanding of development. So if you embody the collaboration and like some of the paired programming practices of the dev and QA, making sure that they're in sync, I think you can get a lot of the ATDD benefits while not necessarily having to be as strict and as future thinking and more spontaneous, I guess would be the way to put it.
That makes total sense, Jason. Okay, here is a question about robot framework. So it's what about robot framework for ATDD? Any footprint or pros and cons?
So my experience with robot framework is pretty small. I know it deals with it heavily deals with indentation and properly spacing and stuff like that. If I remember correctly from when I saw it feels like, and I'm putting an asterisk there, that the wording syntax is unconventional. If you were to like show up and they said, "Hey, we're doing ATDD," and you're like, "Cool, let's bring in robot framework," there might be a disconnect and a dissonance there. But if you are already in a practice that consistently uses robot framework and is very, very comfortable with it, you might be able to make it happen. The big piece with ATDD as a whole is because of the Gherkin syntax. A lot of BAs, dev, and now QE are getting used to that language syntax, and robot framework doesn't necessarily utilize that directly.
All right. Jason, we do have a couple of more questions, but I'm going to ask you one last question since we are running out of time. And there is one very long question sent by Mr. Barry. What we will do is we'll send you this over email and you can respond to it and we can share the response with Barry. And
Awesome.
I'm going
Okay.
to ask you I'll just ask you the last question here, which is how can ATDD help manual testers when they move out to a new company that doesn't use ATDD?
So you can take like a lot of the collaboration practices. Like once again, you don't need to use the tool to get the benefits out of it. So advocating for QE to be at the planning table, say like moving towards an agile scenario or practice as an organization, trying to reinforce that cultural shift is it would be a very important thing for you to execute, because of the fact that that is where the wins come from. It's the high collaboration and the low gap and high feedback loop that you get out of it. So trying to bring some of those collaborative efforts and inserting yourself into the project and the planning effort earlier. This is also part of the shift left movement, that we want to be able to get quality people in place earlier so that way conversations can happen and there are more heads and more input and more people that can advocate for the betterment of the application's quality and for the user at whole. So that is probably what you need to do. if you're going from one place to another is trying to incite that culture shift, because the process won't work without the culture shift to support it.
That's a very good tip, Jason, and that was pretty insightful entire session. So thank you so much. All right, so I'm sure our attendees found it very informative and useful too. So thank you again, Jason, for such an awesome session on correcting the ATDD myths and traps. We did hit on quite a few of them.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining, and more importantly, thank you for being engaging and asking questions and making the most of the webinar for yourself and for the whole group. And if you want to see more such sessions from speakers like Jason and wish to learn more about testing, do join us at the Mile High Conference in Denver on the 28th and 29th of July. And you can have a look at the complete program at milehighTesting.com. Also, let me remind you the call for submissions for the webinars for the year 2020 is open and will be open all year round. Please do send in your proposals as soon as possible to pick up a slot of your choice. Stay tuned for more webinars at softwaretestpro.com. We have an upcoming webinar, which is the secret sauce to continuous deployment testing on the 15th of April 2020. The speaker is Heath Hovey, who is the QA automation lead at Center Edge Software. In this webinar, Heath is going to talk about the secret sauce of automated tests that allows Center Edge Software to continuously deploy most of its web software, both microservices and monoliths. If the subject interests you, please do sign up for the same at softwaretestpro.com. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in Denver in July, and keep practicing your testing skills. Thank you.